with the end of World War II, the perennial question at the end of any war arises, which is how are we going to guard the peace? What kind of a post-war order is going to be created? We've already seen this in the 18th century with the attempts to create a stable order after the War of Spanish Succession. We saw it in the 17th century with the Peace of Westphalia. We saw it very successfully with the Vienna Congress system in the 19th century, and then with the failures to replicate it. For example, Bismarck's attempts to create a system. We saw it at the end of World War I with the Versailles system and the League of Nations. And now the same actors, in a way, the same countries, but with different decision makers, are coming together at Paris to try and figure out what is going to be the future of Europe and of the world. And the result of this is the Cold War. And the Cold War is an interesting name to use because there wasn't any actual war between the two main protagonists of this conflict, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. There was a lot of war going on in the whole world that was tied to the competition, but the two protagonists avoided direct confrontation. And on one side you had the United States and its allies, and the other side you had the Soviet Union and its dependencies. And it should be understood that in both cases we're talking about hegemonic systems. The big difference being the US tended to give a bit more freedom, especially to its important European allies. The Soviet Union tended to hold its allies a bit more dependent on it. Also for economic reasons. The Soviet Union and its fair, as we're going to see, was organized under central planning, while the Western side was organized more along the markets of social democracy or regulated capitalism. But the fundamental question here is simple. With the end of World War II, we have the end of European dominance on the world. Okay, we already said how essentially the turning point was the waning years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, how essentially the decision of the United Kingdom to ally with Russia in the 1900s was a decision to sacrifice European interests in order to guard the British Empire. The World War accelerated this pivot from Europe, and World War II has now completely brought it to the fore, since the two most important countries in the world are semi-European. Now, it's not as huge as change as it sounds. First of all, because both the US and Russia are parts of the European tradition, okay? The United States of America is a settler colony. It's ruled by Europeans, and it's mostly populated by Europeans back then. And Russia is a semi-Asiatic, semi-European country. So it's not a complete pivot away from Europe in a way. But what's important is that for the first time, almost all of the powers that have a stake in the world are not powers that necessarily see Europe as the center of their gravity. So the question is, what form will the global political system have? You see, with the end of World War II, there was no question about isolationism anymore. The Americans were determined to remain relevant and guide the political system that we follow. This is in difference to their reaction to the interwar period. I remind you that the League of Nations was the spiritual child of President Woodrow Wilson, but the United States of America decided to stay out of the League of Nations. Important intellectuals and decision makers believed that that was one of the reasons why World War II happened, and that there was no option for America to stay out of Europe anymore. So both the Soviets and the Americans were interested in creating a new regulatory system. Secondly, these question then went on to how countries would fit into the capitalist world system that existed in the world and that now had become completed in a way. What will be the relationship between the global political system and the global economic system? Because you had an actor, the Soviet Union, which was officially anti-capitalist, okay? But this actor now wanted to be part of international politics. So the question is, what will be the relationships between the Soviet Union and the capitalist system? And what will that take form in global politics? And really speaking, the two antithetical positions was a liberal position on the one hand, which championed the idea that states should be representative, liberal, parliamentarian democracies, with essentially a capitalist system of economy, but a capitalist system of economy that would be regulated, a Keynesian economic system. Do any of you know what Keynesianism is? Did you do it in your other classes? Keynes? Keynesianism? If you did IP or economic classes, there was a discussion about it. Huh? Somebody said something about Keynes over there?
Keynesian system, I said.
Yes, okay. Do you remember by any chance what it was about? Keynes was an economist, a British economist. And after the First World War and after the Second World War, he was one of the key decision makers in the creation of the economic systems. And Keynes believed that capitalism did not work very well without government action, that there was a need for the state to intervene sometimes in the markets to make up for the problems and flaws in the market system. He didn't call for communism or socialism, but it did call for things like minimum wages, the welfare state, some price controls and so on. And on the other hand, you had the socialist Marxist idea, which called for the state control of all of the economy. Okay, we already talked about it. Now, let's look a bit into these protagonists. The US is the strongest major power after World War II. Germany is ruined. Japan is ruined. France is humiliated and facing problems of its own. Italy has ceased to be considered a great power. The United Kingdom is also facing economic problems. The Soviet Union has an impressive military machine and has made impressive strides in industrialization, but the US outpaces it when it comes to economic power. Pretty much the US dominates the capitalist system after 1945 because all the other capitalist powers have been pretty much ruined economically. Now, the goal of the US, the United States decision makers, and especially President Truman and the administration around him going into the new era is first of all to intensify the expansion of the world system, to essentially make the world more capitalist, primarily by promoting free trade. So they want an economic system that above all promotes the free movement of goods and commerce. And politically they want to expand pluralist political systems and see an end to the European colonial empires, okay? Not necessarily because they're altruistic, not necessarily because they're not racist, but see, Nazi Germany kind of makes open assertions of racism not politically correct anymore. Their primary goal is to essentially compete with the Soviet Union as promising freedom to everybody, and also undermine the attempts of European great powers to survive economically by creating autarkic, closed economic systems with the colonial empires. Now, the Soviet Union is the most powerful radical state after 1945. Radical in the sense that it's seeking a transformation of the political and economic system of the world. The problem is, when it comes to economics, the Soviets are negligible. they don't really have a very powerful economic impact on the world. They have a strong industry, especially military industry, but they don't have economic influence because for many years they didn't trade. They don't participate in the capitalist system. So the goal of Joseph Stalin, who is now the unquestionable leader of the Soviet Union, is first of all to as much as possible isolate the Soviet Union from the influence of the world system by autarky, and to expand its political system in the international world. Again, by ending the European colonial empire. So we have an interesting dynamic here. Both the United States of America and the Soviet Union are anti-imperialist in the sense of anti-colonialist. They want to see an end of European colonial empires. So the result of the differences between them is the Cold War. But the result of the agreement between them is this. A map of the world where the world is divided in a huge number of states. The old colonial empires, for example, France ruled all of this area. All of this area are gone by the middle of the Cold War period. But in their place, you have a system of two hegemonic powers that more or less force their allies and dependencies to toe the line. And if you move too much to the one side or the other side, you're in trouble. Any questions? And you can see this here, okay? This is the number of states in the international political system, okay? If you look from 1715 to 1815, the European system is fairly stable. Now, with the era of imperialism, you see an increase of states in the system because the Europeans either conquer or force previously non-state polities to become European states, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. Now, during the World Wars, in the period of the World Wars, there's an uptick because of the collapse of the Austrian, Ottoman, and Russian Empire, but look at this. Look at the Cold War. It explodes, okay? It simply explodes. In just 40 years, the number of states in the international system triples. Just 40 years compared to the last 200 years. This is a direct result of the policies of the United States of America and of the Soviet Union, of their attempt to undermine the European colonial empires, and of the fact that the rest of the world wake up to the reality that Europe isn't a big honcho anymore, a big ahuna. Now, the Cold War includes a political battle, a battle for hearts and minds, a battle of propaganda. Okay, the US and the Soviet Union try to organize politically orders and the relationships to the world system. The US creates a system of coordinated regulation with other major powers. It cooperates with the United Kingdom and France, later on with Germany, and essentially bases its policy on four pillars. First of all, economic alliances. Through the Marshall Plan, the creation of the Bretton Woods system, later on the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization that replaces the Bretton Woods systems, the European Economic Community. The goal is to intensify capitalist exploitation in the international system, to help the states of Europe become essentially better targets for investment. Now, the result is a massive increase in prosperity. Okay? Don't misunderstand this. These are exploitative capitalists, but the fact that the European states become connected to each other through these economic systems permits an intensification of the production of surplus capital, which then is used by Keynesianism to create a better life for everybody. More consumerism, retirement funding, welfare funding, health funding, and so on. Then they create military alliances in order to help the weakest states within the system, especially the peripheries, to survive the challenge of the Soviet Union and to regulate conflicts. For example, Greece and Turkey, that if not regulated within the framework of a Western alliance, could lead to essentially one of the two countries becoming Soviet, and thus creating a divide. Those alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also NATO, SEATO, which was an attempt to do a NATO of the Middle East, which failed miserably because it's the Middle East. The Japan-US Treaty, one of the most important treaties because essentially Japan becomes a protectorate of the United States of America, and ANZUS, which is Australia, New Zealand, and the US. When it comes to political activity, this is what the United States generally does. In places like Western Europe and Japan, where the Americans feel confident that they dominate the system, they prefer supporting liberal parties and moderate socialists, social democrats, to hold power. They support essentially middle of the road to center-left political activism as an internal dam against communism. That's nice. So they support liberal democracy in places like Italy and France. Now, if you're not Italy, France, or Japan, yeah, you're screwed. In places like Turkey, Greece, Egypt, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Vietnam, and Thailand, the United States of America, feeling unsure about its dominance of the political system, prefers military dictators or very conservative regimes, very right-wing conservative regimes. What about the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union also tries to create a system, and it ends up creating a hegemonic system. It tries to coordinate with China to create a two-power balancing coalition against the West, in quotation marks, but it fails. We'll see why it fails. And it ends up with essentially a very centralized system in which essentially the Soviets order their allies around. Some allies have more freedom than others, but pretty much the allies generally have to toe the line. It's based again on 5 systems. First of all, economic alliance. They create COMECON, the Committee for the Economic Coordination in Europe. It's a weird acronym, you can look it up. And unlike, let's say, the European Economic Community or the WTO, the goal of the COMECON is not to intensify free trade. Instead, it is to help the central planning committees of every socialist state to centrally plan their trade. So, for example, let's say I'm the Soviet Union and you're Poland. In COMECON, I would go and say, well, we sit down and we did our regressions and everything, and we need X amount of wheat imports. So Poland, you're going to produce X amount of wheat, and you're going to send it to us, and in return we're going to send you Y amount of industry. The goal is to essentially make every economy in the Soviet bloc dependable completely on the other one. Now, the Americans do that as well. The tools are different. The Americans create dependency through control of monetary capital, through loans. Okay? They control your loans. They own your debt. The Russians, the Soviets, create economic dependency through literally material capital. They literally own your factory or your farm. So both use dependency, but as you can probably guess, the second type could be a bit more problematic for countries that wish to pursue other goals. They create military alliances The central one is the Warsaw Pact in Europe, plus a military alliance with China and later on Cuba. Now, in Soviet Europe, in the places where the Soviets feel they dominate, their political activity is pretty much opposition to liberalization and support for authoritarian dictatorships of the proletariat. The Soviets do not like the idea of Soviet political systems becoming pluralists. So whenever a local Soviet party decides, well, we want to permit a bit more debate, the reaction of Moscow is, "Niet," usually with a heavy dose of tank. Okay? In Western Europe, they usually support socialist parties because the communist parties become very quickly repressed or very weak, and anti-war activists. Whenever the Soviets cannot have a party in their support, they will support pacifists. Since in most of the cases, pacifism in the Soviet Union is illegal, by the way. If you're a pacifist, you go to the Gulag. But in Western Europe, they like the pacifists because the pacifists essentially weaken the resolve of European governments to spend on the NATO funding. Outside Europe, they support anti-imperialism of every stripe. If you're fighting colonial powers, we don't care about what you believe. We don't care if you're an Islamist fundamentalist or a capitalist scum or a bourgeois. We will support you. But once the country becomes independent, well, we would like a conservative and authoritarian Marxist regime. We don't even really care how Marxist they are. We just want them to have power. Stalin liked controlling things. He went through a lot of purges. For example, he liked controlling how much you can clap. Okay, let's see, does this work?
Товарищу Сталину.
Stalin ist der strahlende Held. Im Herbst 1944 hält er eine große Rede. Der Applaus bei seinem Auftritt scheint gar nicht mehr zu enden. Echte Begeisterung. Keiner wagt es, als erster mit dem Klatschen aufzuhören. Eine besondere Vorrichtung hilft aus der Verlegenheit.
If you continue clapping after that, you go to the Gulag. Okay, so let's talk. Okay, so in your notebook, can you tell me the name of the main military alliance created by the United States of America and the main military alliance created by Warsaw, by Moscow? Okay, I'll give a hint over there, so if you can't answer it, I don't know how you're gonna finally finish this class. Yes?
Are you just writing the sections or the countries as well?
No, just write the name of the acronym of the alliance. So the main, by the way, the main one of the United States of America. I don't need the peripheral ones. And the main one created by the USSR. Okay? Huh? The United States of America and the Soviet Union both created, as part of their attempt to regulate the international system, military alliances. I would like the name of the Central American Alliance and of the Central Soviet Alliance. Okay? Just the acronyms is fine, or the name. Just to see how much attention you're keeping or how much you're sleeping. I just talked about them a moment ago, so no mercy. Okay, while you're writing this, the American alliance still exists, by the way, that I'm talking about. Turkey is American. For how long? I don't know. The Soviet alliance doesn't exist anymore. By mistake, I just said the name just before, so if you caught that, good for you. The name is after a capital of a country for the Soviets. Okay? Okay, let me continue while you're pondering that. Let's look at politics and the clashes between the United States of America and the Soviet Union in the early part of the Cold War. And in the early part of the Cold War, the United States of America is dominated by essentially two administrations, the Truman Democratic Party administration and the Eisenhower Republican Party. So in general, the Democrats dominate the political system in the early Cold War, and the Soviet Union is dominated by Comrade Stalin. Tsar Stalinian. That means long live Stalin. By the way, that is what people said when they were executed, before they blew your heads off. Long live Stalin! To show that you're dying as a proud Soviet citizen, recognizing your mistake. Now, the main conflict that starts off, the reason why you had the Iron Wall speech by Churchill, was the fact that the Soviet Union quickly undermined all of the mixed political regimes created at the end of the World War. In Czechoslovakia, Romania and Bulgaria, initially the Soviets agreed to work with bourgeois political parties and bourgeois political leaders within those countries, okay? They didn't immediately replace the governments with communist governments, but they demanded that the Communist Party be part of the government. And what happened, slowly, the Communist Party started purging in every country the bourgeois parties, until in the end, the only parties left were the communists, and those parties subordinate to them. Once the purges were completed, the old elite was executed. So, for example, the king of Bulgaria, Boris III, was executed by the Soviets. The king of Romania was lucky, he escaped. In Czechoslovakia, the foreign minister of the liberal bourgeois government committed suicide by jumping out of his prison cell. Let's put it that way, okay? So, pretty nasty things. In Poland, for example, the Polish Interior Army that was loyal to the old Polish government before the fall of Poland in World War II was purged. They were hunted down and executed by the communists. At the same time, in Greece, there is a civil war going on. Greece was conquered by the Germans, the Bulgarians and the Italians in World War II. And then by 1942, a resistance movement has sprung, and that resistance movement quickly becomes divided between pro-communist forces, which is the biggest resistance movement around, and anti-communist forces like EDES. And what happens is, in 1944, Greece is liberated with the arrival of English troops, and the communists make an attempt to take over the government because they see the exiled government of the royal, of the king, forgiving people who collaborated with the Nazis. They were defeated, then they were purged, and then they took arms again. And they were supported by Socialist Yugoslavia, led by Marshal Tito, and this led to a 3-year nasty civil war in Greece between 1946 and 1949. In France and Italy, again, thanks to World War II, the communist parties become very powerful, and the Soviet Union fully supports them. The United States of America considers those communist parties a threat, but is not willing to essentially undermine the liberal democracies in those places. So, as we're going to see, the Americans find a very interesting way that has to do with money for undermining the communists. Now, when World War II ended, it was decided to divide Germany into a number of zones. Unlike World War I, the German state was dissolved. Okay, officially, from 1945 to roughly 1949, there is no Germany in the world. Germany is divided into 4 zones, each one administered by one of the Allies. Officially, the name Prussia is declared illegal. You cannot create a country called Prussia in Europe. It's actually illegal under the Treaty of Paris. You cannot even call a state in Germany Prussia. The name Prussia has been declared completely illegal. And what happens is, Berlin is special. You see, Berlin, the capital of Germany, is in the middle of the zone controlled by the Soviet Union. But Berlin itself, the city, is also divided into zones of control by the Allies. And by 1948, the Soviets stopped liking this idea. And what they would like to see is the creation of a German state, unified, which would be neutral in the Cold War, and which the Soviets hope to control slowly by political interventions. So they make a blockade of Berlin in order to force the Western Allies to agree to that. Now, when the Marshall Plan is declared, initially the Soviets permit Czechoslovakia to participate, but very quickly decide that no Soviet state should participate in the Marshall Plan. So none of that good, nice money is going into any of the Eastern European states. Turkey was neutral in World War II, and when the Soviets won, they decided to raise the issue of Armenia again, in order to force the Turkish state to become a Soviet ally and to essentially open the straits to the Soviet Navy. As a result, Ismet Inonu turns very pro-American, and Turkey, to defend itself, becomes very close to the United States of America. As a result of the Berlin blockade, and as a direct result of the need to organize post-war Europe, by 1949 the British, French, and Americans unite their zones of occupation in Germany and create the Federal Republic of Germany. In reaction, the Soviet Union then creates the Germans Democratic People's Republic, also known as DDR. So if you know the game Dance Dance Revolution, DDR is also the acronym for the Deutsche Demokratische Republik or something like that, okay? Finally, by 1949, Tito has decided that Yugoslavia has to have its own foreign policy. The Soviets don't like that. They actually threaten war to Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia is able to survive. So how does the United States react to this? In Greece, they support the conservative liberals and the anti-communist side, which means also a lot of Nazi collaborators. The Greek Civil War is a transforming, where you can put the Nazi collaborator in the water and bring out a patriot. As long as you're killing communists, your Nazi collaboration is forgiven. In Italy and France, they support conservative parties, and in the case of Italy, the CIA, which is newly created, organizes a massive letter-writing campaign in which millions of Italian Americans write letters to their families in Italy telling them, don't vote for the communists. And they also spend a lot of money on the Italian Conservative Party, and it works. It actually successfully works. In the first three elections, the communists are actually defeated. So, funnily enough, the CIA's first major success had nothing to do with assassinations, coups, and counter-coups, just getting a lot of Italian Americans like Fabrizio. Don't vote for the comunistas. America is the good side. There is pizza here. Now, in Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, the United States of America supports the existing authoritarian regimes. The Salazar regime in Portugal, the Franco regime in Spain, and the one-party state in Turkey, to later on, in order to become a more nicer Western ally, Inonu decides to permit free elections in Turkey for the first time since the creation of the republic, and you get the Democrat Party created. In Germany, just like in Greece, anti-communism becomes the washing machine in which literal Nazis, not just Nazi collaborationists, but literal Nazis are put in the washing machine and brought out as denazified good guys. By the way, the Soviets also used Nazis, but the Soviets tended to also beat them around. That's the main difference. Okay, the biggest coup of the Americans in the early Cold War is the Marshall Plan. It is a massive success. Not only does it help the Western European economies build up, it also helps persuade a lot of everyday people that America is their allies. And let me give you an example of the Marshall Plan, okay? So if you went to Greece in 1946, literally, families will be given sacks of rice, which will come from America, and would say, gift of the people of the United States of America to the Greek people. It was a very successful propaganda campaign, and they were smart. They actually invited the Eastern Europeans to participate as well. And that's why the Soviets refused to let them take part. It was a great coup. Unlike the interwar period, the United States does not demilitarize. Remember that historically, once the Americans end up winning or fighting whatever war they do, they used to make their armies extremely small. World War II is the time when this ends. There is no demobilization. The United States Army is kept in massive numbers, and it's especially kept in Western Europe in huge numbers. Now, they attempt to destabilize the communist regimes in East Germany and Albania, and they fail. Okay, the one in Albania, the CIA again. So the way the CIA decided to try to destabilize the communist regime in Albania, which was one of the most hardcore communist regimes, is one of the most stupidest things I've ever read in my life. They will essentially parachute Czech, Polish anti-communists into Albania with the hope that then those Czechs and Polish anti-communists will be able to travel back to Poland and Czechia, okay? Sounds okay, they did that in World War II. Here's the problem. Albania was one of the most insular states in the world, okay? So the moment some foreigner shows up, they are immediately turned in. Unofficially, something close to maybe 10,000 people died in these attempts of the United States of America to get agents into the Eastern Bloc through Albania. And they continued doing it because the bureaucracy that was doing it just didn't care about explaining anything to the actual people who ran the agency. They supported Yugoslavia against the Soviet Union. Tito did not become an ally of the West, but he essentially was smart enough to use the Soviets against the NATO and NATO against the Soviets. And finally, they supported alternative anti-Soviet Marxists in Europe. I'm not kidding, the CIA actually funded some of the avant-garde New Left magazines that were published in France and Italy and in the United States of America. So you will be an anti-capitalist but also anti-Soviet, anti-Stalinist Marxist writing about the fall of the evil capitalist system, okay? And state capitalism in Russia, and maybe you don't even know it. Your little magazine exists because of money from the CIA. Okay, that's Europe. What about the world? Okay, both of them undermine the European empires, especially in Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Africa. In China, a civil war is going on, in which on one side you have the Communist Party of China supported by the Soviet Union, and on the other side you have the Kuomintang, which is supported by the United States of America. This civil war ends in 1949 with a communist victory. And the importance of this is this. With the victory of the communists for the first time since 1895, China has a stable, powerful government. It's a nasty government, as we're going to see. But the point is that the era of continued foreign intervention in Chinese territory that had been inaugurated with the First Sino-Japanese War is over. China's long period of entering the world system is now completed in a way. The victory of the Chinese communists has impacts in Korea, which had been divided between the Americans and the Soviets after World War II, in which the Korean communists, who had learned their military trained in the Chinese Civil War, invade South Korea, ruled by an authoritarian conservative regime, which, by the way, was Japanese collaborators. So literally, the Korean War is communist versus Japanese collaborators. And this leads to a war, on the one hand, having Communist China and Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and on the other hand, everybody. Because the United Nations declares war on North Korea. Turkey, for example, and Greece both sent troops to fight in the Korean War. The United States supports the reintegration of Japan in the system, which the United Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, opposes. So Japan ends up being a very pro-Western state, while China and the Soviet Union support communist rebels in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. All three become independent. So what happens is they both force the European powers, okay, in the case of Philippines, it's actually the United States, to recognize independence of those places. And then what they do is they start fighting over who will control the independent states. In all three cases, the United States supports authoritarian regimes. So in Malaysia, you have essentially the whole Sultanate, whatever the hell they have right now, and they had this party that ruled for 50 years. In Indonesia, you have the Suharto regime. In the Philippines, you have another right-wing regime. Down here in South America, under the Eisenhower administration, the US starts behaving very, very stupid. What essentially happens is, with the end of the World War II, in many Latin American countries, there's a new push for democracy. And in most of these places, this push is mostly done by, is done by left-wing parties, but not communists, socialists, social democrats, or left-wing liberals. Well, starting with Guatemala, the Americans overreact and they think every time that a left-wing liberal wins an election, a communist takeover is imminent. So they prefer to undermine democracy and support a military coup to overthrow the elected government and replace it by essentially a hardcore authoritarian government. And this is very bad in Latin America and Central America because it creates the culture of violence and economic depravity that has forced so many people to migrate north. Finally, both of them support the creation of the State of Israel in the old Ottoman territories of Palestine, and both of them support the Israeli army in the 1948 war, the Israeli War of Independence, or the Nakba for the Palestinians. So between 1945 and 1955, these are the major military clashes. The Berlin Crisis, the Greek Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Malaya insurgency, the Indo-Pakistani War, the first Indo-Pakistani War. India becomes independent, but is partitioned between a majority Hindu and majority Muslim country that then fight each other because why not? Okay? The first Arab-Israeli War, and anti-colonial struggles mostly in Asia and mostly against the rule of France and Indochina. Any questions? Okay, this is very deep over here, so I don't want to go too deeply into that because it's a lot of information for you to eat. You're going to get very tired. So let's take a break. Okay? Let me actually cover some of these things because chances are, to be frank, you never read about this in the past, and you're never going to read about this after you finish this class. So this is probably the only chance you're ever going to get to learn a bit more deeply about this. So let's look a bit more into cases. Now, let's look about the early Cold War in Europe and the Soviets. Now, As I said, in Poland, there was a clash between the internal army and government in exile, AK, and the Soviets supported Polish communists. And what's important here is that the United States of America and the UK, in the end, decided to support the communists in Poland. And they did that not because they liked communism, but they came to the conclusion that it's fine to sacrifice Polish anti-communists in order to get the Soviet Union to back down and support liberal democracy in France, the United Kingdom, and Austria, where there were very powerful communist parties. Okay? Now, in Bulgaria and Romania, as we said, initially the Soviets supported mixed government with communist participation, and then they expelled the anti-communists. In both cases, up to 1955, Bulgaria and Romania suffered from anti-communist insurgencies. Okay, the people purged did not give up. There was actual fighting, guerrilla warfare. In Hungary, restored Czechoslovakia, they did the same thing, but there was no insurgencies. Do you know what the difference was? At the end of World War II, Czechoslovakia and Hungary were the places where the Soviets parked their biggest military forces. There were simply too many Soviet troops present in the front lines against the West for any insurgency to work out. Should be clearly pointed out that the United States and the United Kingdom officially did not support any of the anti-communist insurgencies. As I said, the OSS, the CIA later on, did some black operations, but I gave you an example of those black operations, and generally speaking, they were crap. And only in the case of Czechoslovakia did they actually protest officially the fall of the liberal governments. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, literally millions of Axis prisoners of war and Polish AK troops were used as forced laborers. So when World War II ended, if you were caught by the Soviets, you were not freed until 1953. Okay? So if you were captured, let's say, as a prisoner of war in Stalingrad in 1943, you only went back to Germany in 1953. Same thing with Hungarian, Romanian, many Italians, prisoners of war. They were kept for 5-10 years after the war and used to rebuild the destroyed cities of the Soviet Union. A special case is Finland. Do you all remember what Finland did in World War II? Anybody remember? Yes, exactly. The Winter War. The Soviets invaded Finland early in 1940. The Finns did very well, but they were defeated. Then they joined the Germans in the invasion, trying to regain their stuff, but the Finns were smart. They quickly changed sides again in 1944 and helped the Soviets fight the Germans. Now, because Finland had its special history, and because Finland was a coastal state and thus easily under the influence of the Western powers, and in an attempt not to alienate the other Scandinavian countries, the Soviets did not impose a Soviet political system in Finland. Instead, what they did is they permitted the Finns to have sovereignty within the domestic politics, free elections, multi-party democracy, and so on. But in return, Finland agreed to be completely militarily within the Soviet sphere of influence. So this has been called Finlandization, when a country essentially is permitted to keep its domestic political freedom, but its security is essentially controlled by another country. A lot of Greeks fear that that's the great Turkish goal, to Finlandize Greece, permit it to have democracy within, but control its security. I'm not saying this is true, I'm just saying that's what people in Greece think is the ultimate goal of all the Turkish politicians. Whether their name is Ashkener, or Erdogan, or Davutoglu, or Kirichiroglu, or Bahçeli. Now, Western Ukraine, it is hell on earth, an ongoing insurgency that had started all the way back in 1940 and will not end until 1950, which, by the way, is relevant today, because Western Ukraine is the part of Ukraine that really hates Russians, okay? And when in Ukraine they have anti-Russian revolts and they have the symbols of Bandera and the Russians say Nazis, 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 it's complicated. They are anti-Semites. They cooperated sometimes with the Nazis, but most of the time they showed the Soviets. So for many Ukrainians, Bandera is a hero. For the Russians and the pro-Russian Ukrainians, he is a collaborator. Finally, as we said, in Western Europe, they support the participation of communists in government. As we said, the US accept communists in government in France and Italy, but then support conservative parties. In Northern Europe, there is largely restoration of parliamentary democracy. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, all of them become liberal democracies really quickly. And here there's a differentiation. Britain supports the European empires while the US undermines them. And this is going to create a problem between British governments and American governments throughout the early Cold War. Yugoslavia is special in Albania because they are the only communist countries where communism was not imposed by the Red Army. In both cases, the communists were locals. They were able to take control of the countries at the end of the war without the help of the Soviet Union, and they were able to create their own states. So they were both always a bit more independent than other communist leaders from Stalin. They both fought insurgencies until the 1950s. And as I said, by 1945, Tito has become fully independent from the USSR. In Greece, I talked about it very quickly. During the Axis occupation, there was famine. People starved to death. About 300 to 400,000 Greeks, maybe more, starved, depending on who you count. There was endemic violence. Itself, the country was very divided because of the national schism. Its effects still continued 24 years after the schism. And there was a lot of social inequality, especially from those Greeks who had been exchanged in 1923 with Lausanne. They were fairly poor, so they became very radicalized. This led, as I said, to the formation of resistance organizations rivaled by political differences, EAM, EDES, and also mass armed collaboration with the Axis, which many people in Greece don't like talking about. Everybody claims, well, my grandfather and grandmother, they were in the resistance. Well, let's just say collaboration was very endemic in Greece. Exact numbers are not assured, but probably close to 300 to 400,000 people in some way collaborated with the Nazis. Anyway, very quickly, 1943, 1944, there was the first so-called occupation period, Katοχικός Εμφύλιος civil war, in which EAM fought against EDES and security battalions. Then, as we said, in 1944, the EAM tried to create a fait accompli, both for Stalin and for the British, by the December Rebellion. They were defeated, okay? They were forced to disarm by the Partisan Agreement, because Stalin actually supported the national government. So in this case, Stalin told the communists, sod off, I support the royalist government. Stalin did this because he was expected to get return British support for his policies in Poland. So what happened is the Brits sacrificed Polish anti-communists and Stalin sacrificed Greek communists. The Soviets got Poland and the British got England, Greece. That was essentially the swap. Because in 1944, the communists were very strong in Greece. It was the most popular movement. It had the most respect. They had the best military forces. They could have taken over the country if Stalin had decided to suspect it. But Stalin considered Poland important. Why? Stalin was still afraid of Germany and the West. He always was terrified of Western powers rebuilding German military might and attacking him. So he wanted to make sure next time there's a war, Poland will be where the war will be fought and ended. Not in Ukraine, not in Belarus, not in Moscow. So Greece, irrelevant for him. Something the Greek communists never understood. What happened then, as I said, after Varkiza, the right wing starts killing ex-communists. There's vengeance killing. So, you know, your grandfather came and killed my grandfather during the occupation, so now it's my chance to come and kill your grandfather in return, which leads the communists out of desperation to launch another attempt to take over power, which leads to the Civil War. Again, the Soviet Union really does not support the communists. Tito is their main support, and when Tito decides to cut a deal with the West, it's over for the communists. Okay? What followed is interesting. Technically, Greece was a parliamentary democracy after the Civil War. There were elections, there were parties, but in reality, it was a very heavily curtailed parliamentary democracy. And there were massive purges of left-wing people. Pretty much, if you could be accused of being left-wing, or if your grandfather, grandmother, father, mother could be accused of being left-wing, you couldn't get a job in the government, you couldn't get economic assistance, you were pretty much treated as a second-class citizen if you were not outright put in prison or exiled into Aegean Islands. Heavy US influence, the United States had massive influence on it, and the polarization continued unabated. Austria is an interesting case, because it's one case where the Americans and the Soviets worked together and resolved their problems without any civil war, undermining of governments, coup d'etat attempts, or anything like that. Essentially, the Social Democrat Karl Renner organizes a Republican government, which is tolerated by the Allies but not recognized. You see, the Allies told Austria, you guys are as responsible for World War II as the Germans. They didn't treat Austria as an occupied territory, they treated Austria as a full collaborator of Germany. So technically there was no Austrian government. Just like Germany, it was annulled. But they tolerated Karl Renner because they liked him from the interwar years. They divided it into 4 occupation zones, just like Germany, but they tolerated de facto political autonomy. And very quickly, Austria was reunited, and the occupation will end with Stalin's death. But it will be considered a neutral state. Germany was different, I would say, occupied by 4 powers, lost massive amounts of territory to Poland, received millions of refugees, as millions of Germans were expelled from Eastern and Central Europe and resettled. Okay? Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia, Germans from Hungary, the Germans of Romania, the Germans of Russia, Volga Germans. Essentially people who had not seen Germany in 200 years, they were all expelled back into Germany. Okay? The treatment of the German population varied. The worst was in the Soviet Union, where there was, as I said, massive rape. The best was in the United Kingdom, since the Brits were like, oh, we're all bloody Tefkins, yeah, so why not? Here's some chocolate for you, little German kid. But, you know, in each territory, the occupied powers started permitting political reorganization. In the West, liberal with, okay, some Nazi elements. In the East, authoritarian communist. I talked about the Berlin crisis. Again, it was in reaction to the unification of the UK, US, French occupation thrones. The Soviet Union was afraid that the Allies would make peace with Germany. There's no peace treaty yet. The peace treaties are actually signed in the 1950s. By the way, Japan and Russia still have not signed the peace treaty after World War II. Yeah, there has been a state of ongoing war between Japan and Russia since 1945. Yeah, that's part of it. They are talking about signing one, okay? So as I said, Stalin tried to do the blockade, and the way that the Allies reacted was very interesting. They didn't challenge the Soviet blockade on land. What they did is they airlifted supplies. Every day, hundreds of B-17 bombers changed into transport airplanes, and other transporters would fly into Berlin and unload food, oil, and stuff like that. They were daring Stalin to essentially shoot down one of those bombers. Stalin didn't do it because he knew they didn't have the upper hand in an air war. So he gave up, but seriously the problem was he also gave up trying to work with the Allies. Unlike Austria, where the Allies and the Soviets were able to work out a modus vivendi, this is not the case in the Soviet Union, in Germany. So look here, this is what becomes Eastern Germany, the Soviet zone, and here's Berlin, divided into zones as well. All of this is given to Poland, and up there, that's Kaliningrad today. It used to be Königsberg. So they just not, just made it illegal to have the word Prussia. They actually destroyed Prussia totally. Divided, that's the center of Prussia, that's East Prussia. That is where Prussia started. It doesn't exist anymore. Okay? And over here were the zones controlled by the Allies, which then are going to unite and create the Federal German Republic. I talked about the Chinese Civil War. Pretty much everything you understand here is good. One important point, okay? The US government was divided over support to Chiang Kai-shek. The Republicans were pretty much supportive, primarily because Chiang Kai-shek had supported missionary activity. And the Republicans, you have to understand this, were the party of Protestant missionary activity. Okay? Chiang Kai-shek permitted missionaries to expand Christianity, Protestant Christianity in China, so they liked him. The Democrats, on the other hand, didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. They considered him corrupt, which he was, authoritarian, which he was, and essentially a problematic ally. So in the end, the nationalists are forced to retreat to Taiwan, Formosa. And that's why today you have Taiwan and China. Legally speaking, China claims Taiwan, and Taiwan is actually called the Republic of China and claims all of China. But the United Nations after 1960 decided that China is the People's Republic of China and not Taiwan. So it's very complicated, it's very weird. It all starts here. The only reason why Taiwan survived was American protection. The funny thing, today, in Taiwan, the Kuomintang, the party of Chiang Kai-shek, is the pro-Chinese party. So it's the party that actually has great relationships with the communists. And back in 1950, if you were a communist in Taiwan, you were dead. So how history changes everything. Who were enemies once will become friends, and who were friends will become enemies. There is an important effect on this. The defeat in China led in America to a very right-wing part of the Republican Party to launch the question of who lost China. And they accused the Democratic Party, and they said that there are communists in the US government. And that led to McCarthyism, which was essentially a Red Scare, where there was a purge and attempt to prosecute left-leaning people in the American government, which failed, in the American military, which really failed, but not in the media. Any questions? Korean War, pretty much the quick story I said is the story that is contained here. One thing to understand is both North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, And the South Korean leader, Syngman Rhee, wanted to reunify Korea by force. So it's not completely a story of innocent South Korea attacked by evil North Korea. It was more like two angry cats going meow to each other, and then one of them decided, fuck this, and attacking. Okay? The interesting story is how Kim Il-sung persuaded Mao and Stalin to agree to this. You see, Mao and Stalin both didn't want another war right now in Asia because they were busy building their states. Mao just won a civil war. He has this huge country he has to run. The last thing he cares about is fighting America. Okay? Stalin is busy creating his European empire. And he doesn't want to get any problems. But Kim is like, let me reunite Korea, let me reunite Korea. So he goes first to Mao, and like a pestering child, he's going like, let me. Mao says, listen, fine. If Comrade Stalin says he supports you, then I will support you. Okay, fine, okay, cool. Kim Il-sung goes to Moscow and meets Comrade Stalin. But what he tells Comrade Stalin is, hey, Mao is fully supportive of me going in. He lied to Stalin. And Stalin says, well, if Mao is okay with this, fine, I'll support you as well. So, without understanding it, Stalin and Mao gave a green sign to Kim Il-sung to try to reunify Korea. And he invades, and he's really good at it. Okay, the North Korean army is an actual army with tanks and big divisions and everything. The South Korean army is a joke. They essentially, I'll use the map here because it's more fun. Essentially, they invade and they push back the South Korean army and most of the small American forces to this area, the Pushan corridor. Okay, very successful. Now, Kim Il-sung thinks that the Americans are going to give up and leave. Unfortunately for him, Truman, because he's been so much pestered by the Republicans over who lost China, decides to take a strong point, and he goes and he asks from the United Nations to declare that North Korea is conducting an act of aggression. And because the Soviets don't completely understand how the United Nations work, instead of vetoing the American request, they decided to abstain. And most of the countries in the United Nations back then are controlled by America, so they vote for it. So, for the first time in history, the United Nations declares war on a country. And every member state is required to support the war either by sending troops or money. This is the only one of two cases where the United Nations goes to war with another country. Do you know the other case? The first Iraq War. In the first Iraq War, the United Nations officially declared war. They gave full permission. There was no veto. All of the great powers agreed to it. Anyhow, with this, the Americans under MacArthur, they led troops over here in Incheon, and they essentially isolate the massive North Korean army here, which then starts running away terrified. Then the Americans push forward, defeating the North Koreans, and they arrive almost up here close to the Yalu River. And when Mao sees this, he goes like, holy crap! Because MacArthur is kind of an idiot, and he officially says, okay, we've defeated the communists in Korea, now it's time to go and defeat them communists up in China. So what Mao does is he officially doesn't intervene in the war, but he permits the creation of a massive army of volunteers, Fedain, okay, who are then sent in, and they counterattack, and they drive the Allies all the way back to here. And for the next 3 years, there's trench warfare, and no one wins, and in the end, it's a draw. No video right now. Okay, delocalization. I talk really quickly, so it's better to talk a bit more carefully. India, Pakistan, the UK decided on independence in reaction to the Gandhi movement, but also in fear that if it didn't give independence, it would face a communist insurgency in the end. The problem was that the British colony of India was massive and included large amounts of Muslims and Hindus. Now, they had cooperated against British imperialism, but now that independence is coming close, guess what? They decided they don't like each other for religious reasons. So the country is partitioned between India and Pakistan. And the partition is interesting how it happens. You see, what happens is that the colony of India was made up of two kinds of territories. Territories directly ruled by the British, which was about 2/3 of what is today India and Pakistan. And then territories ruled by the old princely families, the Rajas. So you know, when you hear Maharaja, and the British said a Raja can decide to which of the two countries his state will unite. But the problem is this: what do we do when we have a Raja who is Hindu ruling over a Muslim population, or a Raja who is Muslim ruling over a Hindu population? This Peace of Westphalia crap is not working in the modern era. Well, the problem is Kashmir. Exactly in Kashmir, you have a Hindu Raj ruling over a Muslim population. The Hindu Raj decides to unite Kashmir with India. Pakistan says this is insane. This isn't 17th century Europe for the king to decide what their people are going to believe. And this leads to the first Indo-Pakistani war, which is won by India. Okay? In Palestine, millions of Jews from Europe moved to British Mandate of Palestine. Pretty much, if you're a Jew and you survived the Holocaust, the idea of going back to Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Romania or the Soviet Union is not an option. Since they'll pretty much kill you, and they're open about it. So the Soviets say, well, take all those Jews and send them down to Palestine and to give it down. This leads to conflicts between Palestinian Arabs and the Jews. At the same time, finally, after 30 years, all of the British and French mandates are declared independent. That means Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq. They are now considered mature enough to become countries, but essentially the UN does not permit mandatory status. There's a disagreement over the distribution of territory and system of government between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, which leads to the first Arab-Israeli war, where with the help of the Soviet Union and the UK, the Israelis defeat all of the Arab armies. It is not as impressive as it sounds, because most of the Arab armies were crap also. Okay? The West Bank is surrendered to Jordan. The rest of Palestine becomes the state of Israel. The Arab states refuse to recognize it. In Vietnam, at the end of World War II, the Vietnamese asked for independence. The French Fourth Republic says, jamais, no. And this leads to war. The Viet Minh, under the nationalist Ho Chi Minh, supported by the Soviet Union, began an insurgency against France. And it has to be very clear, in this phase, Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist, he's not a communist. He becomes a communist because, well, his main support is the Soviet Union, so he starts making sure to sound much more useful to the Soviets. In Indonesia and Malaysia, you have independence. Indonesia, the government is supported by the Soviet Union and China, and supports Chinese communist rebels in Malaysia, which are defeated by the UK in the Malay emergency. And ever since then, every idiot in this world who wants to conquer a country and rule it thinks that they can be as successful as the British in the Malay insurgency. when the Iraq War happened, the second Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld was saying, well, the British succeeded in the Malay insurgency, we will succeed against them. 1 point of success. And in the Malay insurgency, the communists were a minority. It was pretty much the Chinese of Malaysia, who are a big population, but they were only 10%. I mean, it was literally an ethnic conflict in which you would have a small minority trying to conquer a huge country. Of course it would fail. Just ask the Armenians, 1918, how will it happen with them? Now, here is an important point. Write it down in your notebooks. Why wasn't any World War III? Okay? I had students in America come into my office and tell me, Professor, you know, we're Americans, we're strong. Why didn't we attack the Soviets in 1945? We could have kicked their ass. There were thinkers and political and military leaders in the West in 1945 that called for a continuation of the war against the Soviet Union. For example, George S. Patton, the American general. There's a great film about him. You can go watch it. Patton, he was like, come on, unleash me on the Soviets. Ruff, ruff. No, take them all down. Okay? Curtis LeMay, let's do this. Marshall in the Korea, let's do this. There were a lot of people who were saying, let's rearm the Wehrmacht and invade. So why not? 3 reasons. Okay? First reasons. Nuclear weapons. It's true that in 1945, okay, to roughly 1949, 1950, only the Americans have nuclear weapons. But after 1950, also the Soviets have nuclear weapons, and that creates a deterrence effect. Secondly, war weariness. Both the Soviet Union and Europe is devastated by World War II. A renewed round of great power warfare could be catastrophic, even without nuclear weapons. In the end, the result might be regimes that neither the Americans or the Soviets would want. Third, realistically speaking, the Soviets didn't want a war in the 1950s because, simply put, the Americans had the upper hand. Again, don't make the mistake of being impressed by the big parades and the big tanks and everything. The US had industrial preponderance. Its naval power was 100 times greater than the Soviet Union. Its military power at full mobilization could match the Soviet Union very easily. When it came to the important technological weapons, the Americans have the upper hand, and Stalin understands that. So generally speaking, in this era, the Soviets, they prefer political contests with the US. They don't want a military contest. They don't provoke the Americans into a war. And frankly, why would they fight? Communism is cool in the 1950s. Young people like you want to be communists. Nazim Hikmet here in Turkey, everybody is reading, who's young, reading his poems and everything. It's cool to be a communist. Communism is the future. It is a progressive future. There is no reason to fight because Stalin expects that the future is red. Okay? Unlike the Soviets to the Chinese communists, oh, they're more willing to fight. They got no problem. But fundamentally, the Chinese communists are even weaker than the Soviets. So generally speaking, for these 3 reasons, there wasn't any need for a world war. Poland was not worth further devastation of Western Europe. Simple as that. Hungary was not worth further devastation of Italy. Simple as that. To put it very simply, the American government decided American lives are more precious than Eastern European freedoms. And everybody starts getting nuclear weapons, which leads to one of my favorite songs ever, done by a mathematician of all things. This guy was a mathematician, not a musician. This is a great song. I love it so much.
All right. A few weeks ago, the American press reported that China had exploded a nuclear bomb. Now, this was a great leap forward for China, of course, but it was an even greater leap forward for the American press, because for the first time they called it China instead of Red China. For 18 years they've been hoping it would just go away. And for the first time they called it a bomb instead of a device. So, with China possessing the bomb, it makes us wonder, who's next? First we got the bomb, that was good, cause we love peace and motherhood. Then Russia got the bomb, but that's okay, cause the balance of power is maintained that way. Who's next? France got the bomb, but don't you grieve, cause they're on our side, I believe. China got the bomb, but have no fears, they can't wipe us out for at least 5 years. Who's next? Indonesia claimed that they were going to get one any day. South Africa wants two, that's right. One for the black and one for the white. Who's next? Egypt's gonna get one too, just to use on you-know-who. So Israel's getting tense, wants one in self-defense. The Lord is our shepherd, says the psalm, but just in case, we better get a bomb. Who's next? Luxembourg is next to go, and who knows, maybe Monaco. We'll try to stay serene and calm when Alabama gets the bomb. Who's next? Who's next? Who's next? Who's next?
So there you go. Okay, so let's go to the second phase of the Cold War, where we're going to read about the cult of the individual. Okay. This is one of my favorite cartoons created from the Cold War era. They have the bombs, both sides of the bombs, but you cannot use them on any account, so they're shooting arrows at each other because you don't want to use a bomb. Okay, in the middle era of the Cold War, the main questions are three. First of all, who will manage the collapse of the European empires? Who will manage the relations of the new states? And what you see is a movement from the focus on Europe, where there's a balance now, to the old periphery, okay? In Asia and Africa. Let's begin with the biggest event, which essentially determines, okay, that we are in a new era, and that is the death of Stalin. Stalin dies in 1953. If you want to watch something about Stalin, there is literally a comedy movie called The Death of Stalin. It came out recently. Go and watch it. It's hilarious and tragic at the same time. I really suggest it, okay? It's really good. And what happens is, this leads to a power struggle between 1953 and 1958 in the Soviet Union between all of these guys. Lavrenti Beria, Nikolai Bulgarin, Gregory Malenkov, Vyacheslav, Molotov. This is like the most Slavic name you can ever get, Vyacheslav, okay? It doesn't get any more Slavic than this. Clement Voroshilov, see a normal name, Clement. Lazar Kaganovich, Anastas Mikoyan, and one more guy that you're going to learn about later. So all of these guys and that other guy, they play a Game of Thrones. And the winner is Nikita Khrushchev, also known as Stalin's clown. I'm serious about this. The main reason why Nikita Khrushchev did not get purged is he made Stalin laugh. Okay? So never underestimate anybody. The scary guy over here, Lavrenti Beria, leader of the NVDK, the guy who executed everybody, he got shot in the end. So never underestimate the Joker, okay? And Kurzov, when he comes to power, has essentially 5 goals. First of all, maintaining Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Secondly, integrating the Soviet Union into the world system. This is important. Stalin tried to keep the Soviet Union autarkic, okay, isolated from capitalism. Kurzov says, screw that, we need money. So he actually permits a lot more capitalist penetration of the Soviet Union compared to Stalin. Support nationalist and socialist movements outside Europe. He starts throwing more weight outside of Europe. 4, and most important, change the goal of Soviet industry from production of military goods to consumer goods. He said, if we are going to win, we have to persuade people in the world that being a Soviet citizen is not just morally better than being an American citizen, that we have a better life than the average American. And you can't have a better life when your country is continuously producing tanks, and you're using irons made in the 1900s. So Kurzov says, it is time to create Soviet washing machines, and Soviet ironing machines, and more Zastava cars for everybody. Make the people happy. And 5, de-Stalinization of the Soviet system. Get rid of the paranoia, of the centralization that had been created by Stalin. Because Kurzov understands this. Communism is a popular ideology. If he can fix some of the excesses and flaws of the Stalinist era, he firmly believes that they will bury the capitalists, not in a war, but by persuading the masses to essentially become communist. Talking about de-Stalinization, let's talk about the... How many pages was that speech, by the way, in its full? The great speech. So, you're a communist, okay? Ardent member of the party. You survived the purges in the 1930s. You survived the purges in the 1940s, okay? You are hardcore, and one day, the new leader of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, comes up in a big meeting of all the communist parties and puts out a 20 or 30-page speech called The Cult of the Individual. And right in front of your eyes, everything you believed is pulled out. So what does he say in that speech? I divided it into parts for you guys because if one of you had to read the whole thing, you would go crazy. So which part did you have to read?
The second part.
Okay, so what does he talk about in the second part?
During the Lenin's Life Party Congress were executed on a regular basis concerned about domestic and foreign policy and the position of the party and the government. After Lenin's death, Stalin started to abuse his power and the number of the party congress started to diminish. In his report, Nikita Khrushchev criticized the cult of individuals and foul practice that were done by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin during his power till 1953, and the liquidation in the government and army. While Khrushchev strongly criticized Stalin in his speech, he provocated Vladimir Lenin, who is the Bolshevik leader and the Soviet Union Communist Party. So he defended Leninism against Stalin. There is a comment on expression public enemy, which was developed against Trotsky. The party violated the collective leadership when the delegates in 17th Congress of all Union Communist Party Bolsheviks were forced. Some of the delegates were announced counter-revolutionary and most of them got hanged. The 17th Party Congress is known historically as the Congress of Victors. The documents were fabricated. So, NKVD guaranteed the liquidation. The role of Stalin during the Great Patriotic War was exaggerated. Crucial acts of violation of socialist legitimacy began after the murder of Sergei Krov. The secretary of the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee. Abel Yenikits signed the directive that composed of 3 clauses without approval of the Politburo. This directive became the base of the abuse against socialist legitimacy. Cross murdered many things which are inaccessible and mysterious. After the murder, top functionaries of the Leningrad and KVD were given very light sentences, but they were shot.
Okay, thank you. And Mulder, you have the part 3?
Yes. In the third part, Stalin, Khrushchev talks about that America, Churchill, didn't like the Stalin's idea of the socialism and communism, and that time to time Stalin become more distrustful, and he could just see people and ask why their eyes so shifty, why they look so funny today, just because he didn't trust them. He misused the power he had, and he talks about the war. It cost too much for the Soviet to be in a war, and Stalin didn't see it. So Khrushchev tried every possible way to show the cost of the war to Stalin, but still he was he couldn't get out of the power he had till the very end. And in the end, he asked where was all the military command, where was all Politburo and bureaucrats, and he comes to the conclusion that this all was in the false light, and all it was under the Stalin's control.
Yes. Anybody else have a part? So pretty much Khrushchev tears Stalin apart. Nowadays we know that some of the things that Khrushchev said were exaggerations themselves, but the important thing, this speech destroyed the communist movement because it led to a division between the Stalinists, the Marxist-Leninists, and other groups who have been debating on and on the exact speech since ever. So for example, in Greece, Syriza is that part of the Communist Party that in reaction to de-Stalinization broke away from the old line, while the Communist Party of Greece, KKK, is actually a Stalinist party. For them, Stalin did nothing wrong ever. Literally. He is the greatest hero ever. Let's talk a bit about Khrushchev. You know, being the clown to survive has an effect on his way of behaving. He was rather weird in the way he reacted to things.
When during England's Prime Minister Macmillan's speech, the Russian leader constantly interrupted and then pounded his chest in a show of contempt.
That's Khrushchev over there.
Stark told weathered Khrushchev's attacks with dignity, refusing to resign his duties to the smaller nation. What Khrushchev had hoped would be a smashing propaganda victory turned into a crushing defeat. His boorish conduct did much to alienate Russian sympathy among neutral nations.
Propaganda, of course, from the other side. In one United Nations speech, Khrushchev literally took his shoe out and started banging like this on the podium and said, "We will bury you." So he was very theatrical. On the other hand, he actually visited America. Khrushchev made a big visit to the United States of America. Now, Khrushchev's hope was to present a more pluralist, humanist, more affluent version of communism than the one presented by Stalin. The problem was that when you open this political space, it always leads to challenges, not just to specific politicians, but many times to the whole system. In the case of Khrushchev, his liberalization led to challenges to the Soviet Union from three main groups. In Poland, Polish workers, sick and tired of the very harsh communist regime, literally the regime was controlled by a Soviet marshal, engaged in massive strikes. In the Soviet Union and the Soviet systems, it's prohibited for the workers to strike. Why? Well, the workers rule. So who are the striking workers striking against? That's the logic. In East Germany, the same happened. And in Hungary, the Hungarian communists and the people also challenged the control, the level of control of the Soviet Union on them. Now, none of these movements called for the restoration of capitalism, okay? But what they demanded was for bigger freedom of their countries within the alliance of the Soviet Union. They wanted to be allies, not dependencies. Well, in all three cases, Khrushchev reacts with force. And the Soviet Union puts down these rebellions, which it calls imperialist threats, by extreme force. The result is the fortification of Soviet rule. But at the same time, after killing all of the people Khrushchev considered dangerous, he actually permits the gradual liberalization in some Soviet satellites. This especially happens in Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And the reason for this is that he decides that the best way to avoid situations like Hungary, where literally the Warsaw Pact invaded Hungary and there was military fighting between the Hungarian Red Army and the Soviets. And to avoid repetitions of Yugoslavia, defections, some freedom had to be given to local communists to apply pluralization where they thought it was useful. And again, to show communism as able to provide a good life. What about the US in the same era? In America, there are two administrations that dominate in this era. One is the Eisenhower administration, which continues, and then it's the JFK, John F. Kennedy administration, okay? And there are a number of common things between them. Both are anti-communist, and both have an ambivalent attitude towards anti-colonial struggles. Unlike Truman, who was more or less supportive of anti-colonial struggles, both Kennedy and Eisenhower tend to have a bit more of a problematic position. Differences: use of nuclear weapons and US conventional interventions. Eisenhower had a strategy of full retaliation. He said that if the Soviet Union invades by conventional means a Western country, the United States of America will retaliate with nuclear weapons. The problem for Kennedy was that he considered that this policy straitjacketed America, because essentially the only options America had if the Soviet Union ever did something was either destroy the world or accept losing. So he put a system where the US could retaliate to Soviet conventional challenges by conventional challenges, leaving the nuclear weapons only for the last resort. Both of them have to deal with the civil rights movement. America in the 1940s and 1950s is a very affluent country, but it's also a very racist country, with African Americans facing political disenfranchisement and social exclusion in the South, and pretty much social exclusion and forms of disenfranchisement in the North. This leads to the movement by Martin Luther King and other African American leaders in coalition with left-leaning liberals to demand the end of Jim Crow. And the American presidents have to decide how they're going to deal with this. And they are ambivalent on this, but ultimately they choose to support it. Now, Eisenhower did not challenge the Soviet Union when it crushed the worker strikes in Poland, the worker strikes in East Germany, and the Hungarian attempt at independence. So he essentially said, Eastern Europe is yours, I recognize whatever you have to do there, okay? Let me now give you an example of US propaganda. Okay, the kind of cartoon that was shown in American television and American cinemas to persuade people that the communist system was a problem, well, the capitalism was the good one. Don't worry, later on in class we're going to see the Soviet propaganda and we can decide which one of the two is cooler. Okay, so this is an American cartoon by Disney.
America is many things to many people. To a 17-year-old kid, it's the malt shop on the corner. To Grandpa, it's the front porch in the cool of the evening. To Mother and her family, it's church on Sunday morning. And to Dad, it's his favorite relaxation. It's the Cracker Barrel philosophers in Crabtree Corners. And it's the tycoons in Wall Street. It's all races, creeds, and religions. It's freedom to work at the job you like. Freedom of speech and to peaceably assemble. Freedom to own property. Security from unlawful search or seizure.
Where's your warrant, Flatfoot?
The right to a speedy and public trial. Protection against cruel punishments and excessive fines. The right to vote. And to worship God in your own way. It is these freedoms that have made America strong.
Okay, so we got our freedom. But management's lost of everything.
Labor is at fault. It's ruining the country.
My constituents, as your elected representative, I can assure you Labour's right, management's right. I'm speaking from
Labor, management, politicians, bully. They can't tell corn from oats. Right. Step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery is somewhere pure in the ailment of the body politic. It's terrific. It's tremendous. Once you swallow the contents of this bottle, you'll have the bountiful benefit of higher wages, shorter hours, and security. Enormous profits, no strikes. Remember, you're the big boss. Government control, no worry about votes. Name your own salary. Bigger crops, lower costs. Why, instant even makes the weather perfect every day. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
Pardon me. And who are you, my good man?
I'm John Q. Public.
Ah, my fine friend, you're just in time to share this generous and gigantic offer. Sign right here.
Mind if I read it first?
Hurry up!
keep your shirts on, boys.
Good. Freedom. Freedom? What? Sign away my freedom. Why, this is ridiculous.
Don't be corny, brother.
Sure, our system of free enterprise isn't perfect. But before we throw it away for some imported double talk, let's turn the clock back a few years to see what it's done for us. For example, back in the 1890s, Joe Goats was just a guy who liked to tinker around his barn. Some people thought Joe was lazy. Some even thought he was nuts.
But one day, he had an idea. And because he was free to dream his dream and tinker, Joe had a chance to make something of himself with his idea. So, of course, some people didn't think so much of Joe's idea. But that didn't stop him. So Joe got some money from young Aunt Minnie and Uncle Angus and Grandpappy and Mr. Titus. When Joe's friends and relatives used their savings to help him buy tools and property, they were capitalists. Don't blush, folks. It's nothing to be ashamed. Now, naturally, Joe needed some help. So he hired Willie Lumpkin, who was out of work anyway. And before long, Willie had the know-how and became skilled labor. Because capital, management, and labor worked together, Joe's idea grew. It grew and did things even he never dreamed of. Today, the automobile industry provides millions of jobs that never existed before. And remember, this is a story of only one industry. There are thousands more scattered all over the United States whose history of development is pretty much the same. We've built a country under the American system that sends more young people to high school and college than all the rest of the world combined. Why, even in the Depression, our wages bought more food, clothing, travel, and entertainment than the wages of any other people in the world. Our country has a national income equal to the total national incomes of any other six-nation world. With only 7% of the Earth's, we drive 70% of the world's automobiles. That's just a sample of the things the capitalistic system has given us in only 160 years. Before signing up, you boys ought to try a little taste of Dr. Ism's formula to see what you get in exchange for your freedom. Go ahead, try it.
You can't do this to me! I'll strike!
The state forbids strikes.
Wait till my union hears about this!
Ah, yes, the union. Welcome to our ranks, number 1313.
I'll take this case to the Supreme Court.
The state is the Supreme Court. Our decision is as follows. No more private property. No more union.
I'm voting for a stop to this.
Farmers don't vote anymore.
What did I do for seed next year?
You won't have to worry about next year. The state will do your planning from now on.
We must fight to regain our freedom, but everything is lost. Everything!
Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine.
When anybody preaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other through class warfare, race hatred, or religious intolerance, you know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives. And we know what to do about it.
And now just quickly, no violence, please. And no more bubbles. No bubbles.
So you get the idea. I'm just going to point out that the foreigner brings the evilism ideas in, and everybody was white in the four groups. But that is classical American propaganda from the early 1950s, 1960s, in which Disney, by the way, and the Looney Tunes companies were all pretty much part. Later we'll see some Soviet cartoons as well, so don't worry. Now, let's talk about the 1960s, okay? The rage 60s, the rock and roll era with Elvis Presley and the Beatles and stuff like that. Okay, what's going on with Germany? West Berlin again. Okay, remember Stalin had tried to control West Berlin with a blockade, it failed. Well, Khrushchev also believes he has to do something. Now, there are two reasons for this. First of all, he has a problem. People leave East Germany through West Berlin to go to West Germany. East Germany is facing a brain drain. Okay? People live it. They want independence, freedom, better lives, or they just are greedy and they're leaving the socialist experiment and going to the West. So the existence of West Berlin in the middle of Eastern Germany is essentially a door through which everybody can escape. Secondly, he hopes to make the US seem weak with the hope that that will lead to the defection of American allies and the neutralization of Western Germany like Austria was. Okay? And he has reasons to believe this because France under Charles de Gaulle is behaving very independently from NATO. If the Soviets have to deal with Tito and Yugoslavia, the Americans have to deal with de Gaulle and France, including the creation of a French nuclear program that is independent of America. Third, he considers Kennedy to be weak and wants to test him. Kennedy was the youngest man who had become American president until then, and also he was the first Catholic to become an American president. All previous American presidents were more or less Protestant. Okay? So he believed that Kennedy is going to be a weak president, and that would make him more willing to accommodate. Finally, the Americans have put a lot of nuclear weapons in Europe, and the Soviets have no way to counter them. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union still does not have the ability to reach the American mainland with its nuclear weapons. Guaranteed, because they don't have missiles yet. The space race has not produced yet the technology for intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the presence of American nuclear weapons in Europe, including the long-range bombers the Americans have in America, makes it very hard for him. So there is a crisis between 1958 and 1961. Essentially, Khrushchev says that if the United States of America does not agree with him on something, he will sign a peace treaty with the German Democratic Republic. Eisenhower does not budge and Khrushchev does not push it. In 1960, the Soviets capture a U-2 plane, so not the U-2 Band, but the U-2 plane, which tells the Soviets that the Americans have perfect information about the Soviet Union. They've been spying on the Soviet Union ever since the 1950s. In 1961, Khrushchev decides to escalate the crisis with an ultimatum, demanding that West Berlin be incorporated into Eastern Germany, and Germany be neutralized. Kennedy reacts with both conciliatory acts, but also a military buildup, which forces Khrushchev to back down. His solution is to build a wall. Since he cannot persuade or scare the Americans into acquiescing to giving him West Berlin, he decides that the only way to protect and maintain the survival of the Eastern state of the Democratic Republic of Germany is to essentially isolate West Berlin from East Berlin and East Germany by literally building a wall, the Berlin Wall. Now, here's the thing. On a practical level, it worked greatly. Once the wall was built, it became extremely hard for people from the East to escape to the West. It succeeded. Make no mistake. Walls do deter the movement of people. You build a wall, less people are going to cross. As simple as that. But it was a massive image loss for the Soviet Union. Here's Khrushchev telling everybody life in the Soviet Union is better than in the West. He's building a bloody wall. Okay? To keep course, officially, Eastern Germany, the Soviets saying the wall is built to protect the Eastern German people from spies that are trying to cross under the land and stuff like that. But no one buys that. It's a big image loss for the Soviets, because from now on, the Soviet Union is considered literally as an iron wall. You have to understand it. Churchill talked about the Iron War in 1946. There was no iron wall through. There was no war until 1961. That's when the wall was built. And yet it was such a powerful symbol for many people, for right or for wrong. It encapsulates everything about the experience of communism in power. Now, here are the the consequences of this crisis in Europe. It brings out a change in American policy to the wars. There is increased support by Kennedy for authoritarianism in Greece, which will lead to the colonial coup in Judah in 1967. At the same time, in a counterbalance, they push Portugal under Salazar and Spain under Franco to liberalize a bit, to weaken the image of US as supporter of right-wing authoritarianism. Because you remember the cartoon where it said, in communism, labor is punished by the prohibition of strikes? Well, guess what? Among the right-wing regimes that the United States of America supported also prohibited strikes. So how can you tell to a worker, well, our system is better than that system, when both systems prohibit strikes? Spain, Portugal, Korea, all of them prohibited strikes. There is an increase of US military presence, and this is a disputed thing. According to many left-wingers and some right-wingers, this is when Operation Gladio began. The idea of Operation Gladio supposedly being a secret program by the CIA and local anti-communist cells and local intelligence officers to create essentially the conditions for a military takeover of Greece, Italy, or Turkey in case of war. The 1980 junta in Turkey is considered as the result of Operation Gladio. Now, it's not clear how much of this is as planned as people say, whether it really exists, but it's a big, at least, theory among a lot of people, with some indicators of support. But the end result is this: Europe becomes stable. With the resolution of the German question by the Berlin Wall, competition and political domestic problems in Europe that might lead to great power conflict become frozen. As a result, great power competition moves to the Middle East, where the Arab-Israeli conflict continues going on. Now, here's what's going on. Most of the Arab states that were made independent in the 1950s, they were ruled by traditional elites, military or aristocracy elites, or essentially ittihadists, political parties whose heritage goes all the way back to the Ittihad Veteraki Firkas in the Ottoman Empire, or the Arab Liberal League, okay? Many of these states are very fractured. Lebanon, for example, is a deeply sectarian society. Some others are not. Egypt is an overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim state. And in World War II, many of them courted Nazism. What happens is, with the defeat by the Israelis in the first Arab-Israeli war, a lot of these countries essentially become very unstable, okay? By the way, the Israelis committed ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians when they won, and the Arab states committed ethnic cleansing against their Jewish populations in retaliation. So there was a movement of populations. Now, I want to play this song. You know what? We'll stop here because I'm also tired and you are tired. Okay? And we'll continue next week. Okay, so remember, next week we have class twice. We have class on Wednesday and we have class on Friday. Okay? Any questions? Anything else? Okay, you're free to go. Turn in your notebooks, please, so I can grade it.